Again, welcome to this week's office hours for ESG and ESGCV. My name is Shavonna McCaleb, and I am today's moderator. If you are just joining us, please go to the chat and introduce yourself with your name and the region you represent. As a reminder, this office hours session is being recorded for public record. Office hours recordings are on the California ESG CV Past Trainings webpage. A copy of the slide deck and recording will also be emailed to you. Next slide. How to ask a question. All questions must be submitted in the chat box. Please type your organization and question into the chat box. The team will read questions out loud at the end of the presentation and will provide answers, if possible, throughout the presentation. All questions and answers entered into the chat box will be recorded as part of the public record. Next slide, please. Today's agenda. ESG and ESGCV updates, office hour updates, upcoming trainings, ESG and ESGCV Q&A, and today's spotlight session, emergency shelter policy and shelter inspection reports. Next slide, please. On this slide, we have ESG policy documents. The links will be provided with the slide decks. Next slide, please. On this slide, we have your ESG team representatives. Please reach out to your ESG team representatives listed on this page if you have any questions. Next slide. ESGCV update reminders for performance milestones. All program funds for projects, street outreach, emergency shelter, rapid rehousing, and homelessness prevention must be expended by September the 30th, 2023. All funds for HMIS and administrative costs shall be expended by October the 31st, 2023. Final requests for funds, RFFs, must be submitted to the department by November the 15th, 2023. Next slide, and now I will hand it over to Chris.
Thanks, Shavonna, and thanks everyone for joining us this morning. My name is Chris Pidgeot from ICF, and I'm just going to talk a little bit today about a session we had a couple of weeks ago, where we invited California Interagency Council on Homelessness, or CALICH, to join us to discuss about what happens as the ESGCV project sunsets. In some of our communities, that is already beginning. In others, we need to start thinking about that now. As you know, the ESGCV program is much larger, $4 billion nationally, $319 for the state of California. And as that money comes to an end, annual ESG cannot support all of the ESGCV activities. It's just impossible. We cannot 10 times our program and expect that to stay along. But we are very fortunate in the state of California to have other funding sources by which we can look at sustaining programs. So we want to think through these 5 bullets here and talk through each one of them a little bit. The first is spend down timing. Know when you're going to be getting close to the end of your project. Know that you have to be done, for most of us, by September. If you have reallocated funds, that is actually a little bit longer, but that is not the majority. That's only $3 million. The majority of our $319 million ends in little less than 5 months. So begin to think about that spend down timing. And we did have a presentation, and this was a couple of weeks ago, I believe 2 weeks ago, that HAP funds have flexibility and can do all the things that ESG does. So if you have ESG CV programs that you really think are good and you want to keep, you need to have conversations with your continuum of care about using HAP funds for some of these projects. Also think about when you're going to stop accepting clients. You don't want to keep enrolling clients in programs that only have a month or 2 to go. So think about that for your project type. What does that mean? For shelter, that might not be a problem. For rapid rehousing, could be a big problem. So think about when you stop accepting new clients into your program for specifically for rental assistance. Also think about your staff. A lot of us had to staff up, us included, all the grant administrators here, our new staff through ESGCV. So what happens as caseloads decline? What happens to the roles and responsibilities for those staff? How do we sustain that staff if we need to do so? That again could be looking at other funds, including HAP. And then do not forget the clients. The last thing that HCD wants and HUD wants is for us to make folks homeless. because funding goes away. That is one of the cardinal rules for HUD funding, is don't make people homeless once you've made them housed. So think about how you're going to end that assistance or transition that assistance to HAP or other funding. So we're going to keep saying this type of messaging as ESGCV is winding down for you to continue to think about. We can take questions and comments each week, but we're going to keep showing the slide and talking through similar things each and every week moving forward. Shivana, back to you.
Thank you, Chris. Next slide, please. HCD office hour updates, upcoming training topics on 419, new client file checklist on 426, leases, habitability and lead, on 5.3, rental assistance agreement, and on 5.10, we have rent reasonable and fair market rent for rapid rehousing and HP. Below, view the links below to register for future office hour sessions and to view past recordings. Next slide, please. Upcoming trainings on April the 18th from 10 a.m. to 11:30, hiring people with lived experience. Next slide, please. Upcoming trainings for May on May the 2nd from 11 to 1 p.m. Documenting costs, new and non-traditional provider series on May the 10th from 12 to 1:30, data-driven decision-making community workshop. Next slide, please. At this time, do we have any questions in the chat box? Okay, and we do not have any questions. As a reminder, please put your questions in the chat box as we go through the presentation. Next slide. How to contact us. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, please reach out to your annual ESG representative or to your ESGCV grant administrator. Next slide, please. And now I will hand it over to Chris Andrews for today's spotlight session, Emergency Shelter Policy and Shelter Inspection Reports.
Great, thank you so much, and good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here today. We're going to talk through emergency shelter housing standards, how to go through that standard inspection checklist, and looking at lead-based paint as part of that. If we can go to the next slide. So I think it's important to ground ourselves of why are we caring about housing standards? Why are we looking at these? The goal of any shelter, and we'll be talking about permanent housing standards in a couple of weeks. These are, the minimum standards, the standards that have been identified by HUD, that have been identified by industry leaders, that will ensure, decent, safe, sanitary living environments for anyone who is in that shelter or in that housing. And I think it becomes really important to hold that as this is the goal. And I think that word minimum is really important. There are a lot of instances that communities will strive to add more standards, change those standards, and those are encouraged if that is something that works for you, if that is a need that you're seeing in your community. These are not the maximum, they are indeed the minimum from a HUD perspective. So next slide. So what are the minimum standards? The minimum standards for shelter are, we'll talk through them in more detail of what goes into it, but it's summarized in 576 403B, and making sure that you are meeting any state or local safety and sanitation standards. Right, that becomes very important, that if there are state safety standards or local state safety or sanitation standards that are more stringent than the HUD requirement, like anything within HUD and ESG programming, you need to make sure that you are operating under the more stringent requirement of the two, and making sure that you're meeting both. If you have a policy that is exceeding HUD standards, you need to make sure that you're documenting that you are meeting those exceeded HUD standards. And that is something that if you're being monitored by HCD, you'd be looking to say, are you both in compliance with the HUD standard and your local standard? And if you're monitored by HUD, it would be the same. Any inspections need to be completed before your shelter is occupied. So you need to document that that shelter is meeting the standard requirement prior to initial occupation of that shelter. And then need to be able to document that that shelter is remaining habitable and in line with the minimum standards or with your standards for as long as the minimum period of use requirement is in place. So if you're doing a rehab of a shelter and you have a 10-year minimum use period, you need to be making sure and documenting that that shelter is staying in line in accordance with those shelters for that 10-year period. Next slide, please. So the standards are applicable if you are doing any building conversion, any rehab, any other renovation. If you are funding shelter operations, all of your habitability and sanitation safety standards are required. There are exceptions for temporary emergency shelter, and we'll dive into those in a little bit. And then lead-based paint applies to any ESG funded shelter, and that is true also of temporary emergency shelter. Next slide. Okay, so what are the components? What's going into the minimum standards? It's looking at the structure and the materials of what is going into the rehab or going into the space. Access, what is the security of the space, air quality, water supply, sanitary facilities, through food prep, sanitary conditions, fire safety. We are often asked, and we'll get into this more, and we're talking about permanent housing in a couple of weeks, but if you can use HQS, and for shelter standards, even under ESG-CV, you need to be using the ESG standards. There is some flexibility for permanent housing, but the ESG standards for both shelter and permanent housing are a little bit different from HQS. And therefore, even with the ESG-CV waivers for permanent housing, you need to make sure that you're using the ESG standards for shelter. You can't use HQS. Next slide. So in meeting the standards, HUD provides, and we can make sure to send out this link to anyone who is needing it, a sample checklist to go through each one of the standards and making sure, okay, are the structure materials meeting the requirements? Is the access in line with all accessibility requirements of Section 504 and the Fair Housing Act? What are the specifics of the space and security? And you can use this checklist to be able to document, what standards are being met, both in that initial inspection and then in any ongoing inspections that might be occurring. Next slide. So when do they apply? Right, we touched on this a little bit, right, in terms of what does apply. So it applies if you're doing shelter renovations, rehab improvements, if you're funding shelter operations. It doesn't apply if you are only paying for HMIS activities, or only paying for essential services that are being carried out in that shelter. And then again, temporary emergency shelters. But if you're only paying for the HMIS component, if you're only paying for essential services, you don't need to go through the habitability standard checklist for that property. So what are the flexibilities that come with temporary emergency shelter? The shelter standards are waived for any property while it is considered a temporary emergency shelter, and I know we're getting close to the period of time where there may be some conversion of a temporary emergency shelter into being a permanent shelter, at that point in time, you would need to be meeting, your shelter standards. But for as long as that property is categorized as a temporary shelter, you are waived from having to meet your shelter standards. You still must comply with your state and local requirements for safety and sanitation codes, and you still must comply with all lead-based paint requirements, which we'll get to in next slide. So lead-based paint requirements, this applies to any ESG/CV funded shelter or housing. It is applicable if that shelter was built prior to 1978, or if there are children or pregnant people who are residing or may be residing in that property. You need to be going through a lead-based paint visual inspection and being prepared to provide lead-based paint disclosures. Next slide. So again, if that property is meeting those two threshold requirements, right, where there are children present, where there are pregnant people present, and that property is built prior to 1978, need to be issuing lead-based paint disclosure to all program participants. This is a standard disclosure that you can pull from EPA to be issuing. And if you have questions on what that disclosure is, we can post the link in the chat, or we can send it out through everyone's GAs. And then conducting a lead visual inspection of that property. And based on that visual inspection, there might be additional inspections, a deeper inspection, or remediation work that might need to take place. But at a minimum, being able to document that lead visual inspection took place by someone who is certified to do a lead visual inspection, which you can get that certification through the HUD exchange. And the checklist that they would be using is on the next slide, which this is a sample checklist that HCD has for the ESG and ESG/CV program to document that visual inspection and determine if additional inspections or remediation is required, or if there is no visual cues that would lead to risks or concern of lead-based paint in that property. And with that, the very quick summary on housing standards and lead-based paint, both very straightforward of being checklist-driven processes, but want to open it up for questions.
Chris, just a conversation I'd like to have with you maybe for a second. We're really talking about this and what we're going through the next couple of weeks based on a HUD monitoring that California HCD received, and that we didn't have proper documentation for ourselves, which means the folks here who are operating ESG and ESG/CV programs might also not have it. So this is really a reminder for us to make sure that we're doing these things, and remind me, they need to be done annually. Is that accurate?
So that annual is a good goal. That is not set within statute of HUD. It is that you need to validate that the property through its lifespan of being a ESG assisted property is always habitable. But that might be annual. It might be every 6 months. But I think I would recommend annual as a goal, though that is not written anywhere. I think that feels like a good safe harbor.
Thanks, Chris. We do have a question for you. If the shelter is new, do we still have to do an inspection of children or pregnant women?
No,
still
so
have to do.
you have two requirements, right? So lead-based paint stopped being used in 1979. So we're only concerned from a lead perspective of any properties that are, 1978 or before. And so therefore, if that shelter is a new shelter, you don't need to be looking at that. And even if it is a pre-78 property, the second would be, are there or may there be, right, children under the age of 6 who would be in that shelter, or pregnant people who could be staying in that property. And I think verifying that, those two conditions need to be met to complete the visual inspection. Now, like many things, right, you want to make sure that you are documenting that if those conditions, the pre-78 and the children under 6 or pregnant people are not, in that unit, you want to be able to document that negative, and you're still filling out the first part of the certification or a different form, kind of validating to that point that a full visual inspection is not necessary due to conditions 1 and 2 not being met. And I think, Taylor, if we go back one slide, right, it's a little hard to see on everybody's screens, but part 1 is determine whether the unit is subject to a visual inspection, right? And that is, right there where we are seeing, those two questions coming up.
Thanks, Chris. And Timothy, if you have other questions, please do put them in the chat. We have a couple things that keep coming up through monitoring, Chris. I wonder if you could answer as well. If lead paint remediation is required, can ESG and ESG-CV funds be used to remediate those issues?
So it seems we're talking about, can that be for renovations to a shelter property? Yes, right there. I think there are, all the caveats that go into, is that cleared under your project budget? Is that, under your environmental review to be doing that work? So all of those components need to be met, but, can lead remediation be part of a shelter renovation? The answer is yes.
One last thing that we have seen come up as well in some of our monitoring, how do we treat hotels and motels on our project room key type things, which are also subject, but how do we handle that? How do we handle the inspections?
So in terms of how can that visual inspection be carried out in that hotel or in that motel?
That and that hotels and motels seem to fall under TES and are exempt under ESG-CV. Is that, am I going in the right direction here?
From a standard perspective, they're not exempt from a lead perspective. So lead carries through TES properties. One of the things that you can do, right, if you are obligated to be doing a lead visual inspection, and I think, there are plenty of hotels and motels that are being used as a temporary shelter that are pre-78 buildings, is that inspection doesn't need to be in person. It doesn't need to be live. But there is flexibility that it can be done remotely through a FaceTime or through a Zoom, where you're able to have someone walk through the unit, be it the hotel manager or someone else. If you're considering that property, you don't need to be going into those rooms, but in that setting, let's just say that there's a hotel or motel that has, is partially made available for room key. You would be looking in the rooms as well as what are the common areas within that space, that would be considered. I think remediation becomes a little bit of a different item in that case, and I think that is probably easier to think about in a one-on-one conversation of what could be paying for remediation in that hotel or motel, but worth holding and considering. I think just as we're talking, right, and Chris has mentioned this has come up in a monitoring report. I understand, right, and I think the parts of the program were stood up very quickly, and this might have been a requirement that was missed, or it might have been a requirement that wasn't documented. check your files when we wrap up today's call. Make sure, do you have habitability standards? Do you have that checklist filled out for your shelters? Do you have, that lead-based certification form, that visual inspection form, filled out for your properties? And if not, go ahead and make sure to do that now. You are doing it after the point of initial occupation, but still better to do now. Make a note in your file that you did it at this point in time, and acknowledge that, but to make sure that you are doing it.
Chris, do you want me to read that question in the chat to you, or you?
Sure, no.
Yeah.
Yeah, so a question on clarification on lead-based paint disclosures. So your lead-based paint disclosure requirement is only in the pre-78 properties. So I think that is the first. And then who are you giving that disclosure to? The recommended practice would then be that it is going to any program participant coming into that property, is getting that disclosure. But I think in the prior question, right, of the new shelter, at that point in time, you're not disclosing the potential of lead-based paint, because we can be confident that there is no lead-based paint in a 2023 property or 2022 property.
You're welcome, Q. Any other questions or things that we would like to hear regarding emergency shelter inspections and lead-based paint? All right, Shivana, go ahead and take us home.
I think we just got one more question, Chris. So if an interim shelter is receiving, I assume you meant ESG, and is in a building that is being repurposed, does the lead-based inspection still apply? So lead does apply to any temporary shelter. That you still need to meet that lead-based paint. You don't need to meet the habitability, the shelter standards requirement, but you do need to meet that lead-based paint requirement regardless of what type of property it is.
Okay, I think that was the last question in the chat. Thank you, Chris, for today's presentation. Thank you all for your questions. As usual, a quick survey will launch as you exit this session. Please take a minute to reply, as we are always striving to provide useful content and needed technical assistance and training. Have a great day, everyone.